feel guilty over what they've done in war, that is the most likely indicator that there's an increased chance that they're going to commit suicide. And there is, of course, a dramatically increased chance in U.S. troops that they're going to commit suicide, as there is a dramatically increased chance that they're going to be a mass shooter in some public place, although it's, you know, statistically much lower, and none of this is a reason for some sort of stupid prejudice against veterans or anything.
Just don't make them police officers.
So I still have yet in my life to hear a definition of what it would mean for something to be natural and something to not be natural. But I would contend that if anything is not natural, it's something that you have to be extensively conditioned for, and that you're likely to kill yourself about afterwards. You know, how many people have suffered moral guilt, brain injury, or PTSD from war deprivation? Not a single case ever recorded in the history of the world. Right? So you would think if something is natural, it's hunger, it's thirst, it's the need for oxygen. Some people would rank reproductive activities near the top of the list, but not something that not a single person has ever suffered from the deprivation thereof, right? So it's not maybe something, war is maybe something we don't need. How many human societies have lived without war? What percentage of our species that has ever lived on this earth has lived with war versus lived without war?
Oh, many.
Must have lived without war.
According to most anthropologists, I mean, there's always some debate, but it's very likely that hunter-gatherer societies, most of the existence of our species before, you know, settlements, knew nothing that even resembled low-tech war. And of course, nothing before the past century in any way resembled current war. So it's not, and of course many societies up to today and in recent centuries and millennia have lived without war. I mean, even in Europe in past millennia before the patriarchal societies, you had societies without war. In Japan, cut off the West for a few centuries, and all the wonders of Japanese culture that we have learned about flourished in that period. When the British colonies came to the United States, and one of them chose, in stark contrast to all the others, for a period of many decades, not to wage war on the Native Americans, and in relative terms to respect them. And as a result prospered and grew richer, so, you know, started at the bottom and went to the top economically. What was that colony called?
Pennsylvania.
Pennsylvania. You've probably heard of the place. So there are examples. The notion that who's the celebrity astrophysicist Neil deGrasse Tyson? The notion that he pushes that you must have war to have prosperity and science and culture is in contrast with the facts.
But I think, isn't it true that those self-same Pennsylvanians by 1720 figured out that they needed somebody to do the fighting. So off they go to Ireland in 1720 and recruit Scotch-Irish from the villages to go up into the Appalachians and fight the Indians because they're not inclined to do it. In other words, using them in effect as mercenaries.
Self-same Pennsylvanians is a little vague in that the Quakers were not
the Quaker
exactly...
ascendancy in Pennsylvania.
No, I'm a Quaker, so. But my understanding is as long as the Quakers were the majority and in charge in Pennsylvania, there were not wars with Indians. As more people moved in and
Non-Quakers.
And became the majority, the Quakers stepped aside and then they had wars.
But the phrasing of the question is key, because it's key to every defense of every war. Didn't they discover that they needed to, right? didn't George W. Bush discover that we needed to bomb Baghdad? It's never phrased as didn't they choose? And maybe they were right, maybe they were wrong. It's always, didn't they discover that they needed to? And the idea that they didn't need to was misinformed and naive and a mistake. And I think that actually an argument is needed before you can phrase something in that way. You have to actually make a case that it was needed. You can't just say that something that was done. So I mean, we heard, just 1 second, I see, we heard the American Revolution mentioned, right? Are we really going to say that the American Revolution wasn't justified? Can that really be what we mean?
Yes.
And so, I was in Canada a few weeks ago, and I didn't encounter a whole lot of bitterness or regret or despair that they hadn't yet had a violent revolution against King George. And so so the fact that in the United States we needed that, and in Canada they didn't need it, raises a question about what it means to need something. Yeah.
I was one of the people that put my hand up, just partially because I wanted to give you an ability to have a better percentage that got changed.
Thank you for fudging the numbers for us.
But part of it is being a complex person and believing in psychology and that we all have many voices. I do have this voice inside that says, what about Tibet? And they were a very peace-loving people, and they didn't want to build an army, and so consequently they could be easily overrun by the Chinese. So that voice inside of me says, well, you know, maybe there's importance to have a Department of Defense that has this ability to look like we're a place that shouldn't be attacked. And the problem is then you have the military, and then the question is always, if you have these people with guns and they're supposed to protect you, they get out of hand, and then that's what we have now. We have this growing country that has, you know, so much investment in the military. It's got out of hand. But isn't there a place for defense?
Okay, you can raise your hand. 1, 2, 3, 4. We'll everybody try to be fairly quick.
So I just want to say that I think Rico has hit on what kind of encapsulates my position when it comes to how we deal with the threat of war. I think unless we kind of delve down into the theoretical kind of confusion around it all and at least understand that there are exceptions to everything. This is my epistemological position, right? I mean, everything has exceptions, every dogma. You can't recognize what the real threat is, which is a practical threat. It's a practical threat that if you create an army, it's going to get used in the wrong way. It always does. But if we recognize that fact, not that it's a theoretical impossibility that it might be justified to be violent in a particular case, but rather that it's a practical, problem for us as human beings to trust ourselves with a tool like that, right? Then you can't make the effective public policy arguments that we need to make. I don't trust our community to create armies. I don't trust our community to create nuclear weapons. I don't trust our community to have torture, laws that legitimize torture. We don't have the moral sophistication to handle those kinds of things. So in that sense, it's an historical and a practical argument that we need to be making for why we should prohibit these things as law. Laws are always practical tools. They're never dogmatic, permanent realities. But laws are justified because they regulate us as we are currently. So,
okay, we had 3 more people.
Okay. I want to raise something that David, you mentioned a while ago and nobody has commented on, and that is the idea of vengeance. I mean, it's in the Old Testament, an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. And there are cultures and people who believe that's it. You do something to me, I'm going to do it to you, and I'm going to do it worse. And I wonder how that gets responded to.
And if you go back 17 years to the arguments for attacking Afghanistan, you'll discover where one of those cultures is.
Right.
Yeah.
It reminded me that the young Dalai Lama came here in the 1950s begging for our help, and we turned our back on him. So I'm not in the business, I don't think, of humanitarian causes.
Thank you. Okay, two more. Go ahead.
So, we were talking about needs, and I just wanted to throw this question out there. Who benefits? And I think I know, but think about who benefits really in the end, financially, power-wise, in every way, from continuing war. And I think we have how many now? 9 wars going on? And how much it's costing us, and who is making money from that? A lot of money.
And what is it?
Okay, David?
2 points. One is, one of the books back there from World Beyond War is a global security system, an alternative to war, which really, it's the best research that I think has been done on what are other ways of protecting against military aggression, or oppression, et cetera. So it's not that being prepared for war is the best way to get security. It's obviously not working. But the second thing, in terms of Tibet, and we've been to Tibet, but for the Tibetans to have a few guns to fight against the massive Chinese military, is that really going to protect them?
No.
I mean, it's just going to make things worse. I mean, it's going to more repression and more killing and et cetera. So I don't think that's going to help at all in terms of security for Tibet.
Okay, let me try. I see lots of hands and I will get to you, but let me try to give a few brief responses because there are a lot of, I think, important questions that have been raised, including the endless one. You can hold your hand up if you want to, but I will get to you. The notion of defense is one that most people go to, and it's, you know, if the United States War Department, which has been called the Defense Department since 1947, got rid of all the weapons and programs and plans and activities that were by nobody's definition on earth defensive, right? This would, I mean, you might cut 3/4 of the US military, right? If you could argue that it's defensive to have missiles on your coasts and ships on your coasts and so forth, this wouldn't justify having aircraft carriers on somebody else's coast and talking about attacks on US troops in Syria as Syrian aggression and a need for US defense. You know, and so if the United States Congress were to pass a standard that the US can't spend any more than 4 times the next biggest spender in the world on its military, then you would have a major cut in US military spending. And if China were smart enough and did what it always does when the US reduces military spending, that is, reduces military spending, well, then you would have kick-started a reverse arms race.
Yeah.
And the other way to do it would be to actually use democracy instead of bombing people in the name of democracy and let the US public vote on what the military budget would be. This would be even faster in terms of kick-starting a reverse arms race. And when you did that, and when other nations did that, you would gradually, perhaps fairly swiftly, get to a state of affairs where arguments for abolishing war would appeal to a lot more people. You know, so we don't have to persuade people out of the military defense idea in order to move in the right direction. We just have to do something that even resembles that, because what the US military does is offensive in every sense of the word, and it's counterproductive in terms of defense. It endangers. It creates anti-US terrorist groups around the world. When the Gallup polled in 2013 in 65 countries around the world, polled a big sample of people, what country on earth is the biggest threat to peace in the world?
Yes, always.
Well, not always, but the vast majority of countries, the winner was the United States. And if Canada wanted to generate anti-Canadian terrorist networks around the world. It would have to do a lot of invading, a lot of bombing, a lot of kicking indoors, set up some prisons and leak videos of torture. I mean, it would have to go to great lengths to so endanger itself. And so there is, as a number of people said, a problem with building a military to protect you when the military is actually going to endanger you. There is also the alternative of using the rule of law, so that when China invades a country, you can actually appeal to the International Court of Justice, to the International Criminal Court, to treaties that you're party to, if you were party to them, and treat crimes as crimes, not as excuses for bigger crimes. And this is an approach that the United States is working very, very hard to destroy, that the National Security Advisor is threatening with the biggest crime there is, anyone who supports the rule of law.
Right.
It's not just we're staying out of the courts and the treaties, it's we're going to go after anyone who's staying in them. And so this is, this is an alternative that declares that war is the only tool available. But it isn't, so we've been talking about a lot of particular wars, past wars, examples of types of wars that people will argue for. But I think that the case that World Beyond War makes, that's somewhat new to most people, is that if you're going to have wars, you have to have preparations for wars. You have to have the institution of war. You can't just have a war out of nowhere. If Costa Rica wants to have a war tomorrow, or Iceland wants to have a war tomorrow, or any country that doesn't have any military wants to have a war tomorrow, it can't. It's going to have to build a military to do it, as was the vision of the people who created the United States, was you're going to have to raise an army for a couple of years and have a war and then disband it again. And the number one way in which war kills is through the diversion of resources, right? When 1% could end the lack of clean drinking water, 3% of US military spending could end starvation on the globe, 1 or 2% could end various diseases around the world, 10% give everybody free college, 20% give the environmentalists more than they've ever dared dream of, and so on. The top killer is the institution itself. So if, after 75 years of wars that just about everybody agrees are not justifiable, you were to suddenly have the new World War II as we misimagine it, and have a just war that, contrary to possibility, is absolutely impossible. I've written a book called War is Never Just that looks at the criteria of just war theory. There is no way to meet the criteria of just war theory. But just for the sake of argument, we pretend they've been met. That war has to justify also the existence for the past 75 years of the institution of war, of everyone killed through the weapons testing and the pollution and the devastation of preparing for wars. Everyone killed through the poverty and disease and hunger and thirst created by putting all of our money into war. This is a feat that no just humanitarian war could ever possibly accomplish. So when you have an institution that's the top destroyer of the natural environment, the top eroder of civil liberties, the top reducer of reliance on the rule of law, the top fueler of racism and bigotry, the top corroder and poisoner of our culture, the top source of draining our treasury, and you lose all the opportunities of where that money could have gone instead. And then you finally, miraculously, have a good war, a necessary war, a just war. It has to justify all of that damage. It has to outweigh all of that damage and the risk of nuclear apocalypse that wouldn't exist without war. And so it's a feat that can't be accomplished by any particular war, no matter how good, noble, Democratic, Green Party, whatever it is, it can't do it. This is the case that we're trying to make. Okay, you had your hand up.
This is a wonderful conversation, sharing. I'm British. I'm 87 years old. I'm a survivor. I survived the war and attacks on London. I was 10 years old when it started. We went down and suffered the bombing. I was evacuated. I just discovered a little letter from my mother when I was 10 years old. When I was away, I was evacuated into the country to a family I didn't know, saying, "Don't worry about me, Mum and Dad. I'm doing okay. Everything's okay, and I'll keep you informed." A 10-year-old worried about his mother and his response. I'm a veteran. I was in the Korean War. I was drafted into that war. As an alien, I was not American. I got drafted and I went. I didn't kill anybody. I couldn't. But I learned through that exposure of being in the Marine Corps to hate war.
All right.
It backed every experience I had as a child. There's no profit from it, and yet, of course, I would not be here if it hadn't been for war. My sister married an American, armed forces, and came to live in this country. I came to live with her as a 17-year-old because things were so rough in England after the war. And my mother said to me, "Brian, that's the place to go." My father said, "We've already sent your sister, your daughter over there, now you want to send your son." She says, "Yes." And I came over here. I would not have been married, I wouldn't have met my wonderful wife, who's born in New York City, 56 years, have 2 children, have a PhD in psychology from the University of Wisconsin. If I hadn't had war, which is odd, I wouldn't be here if my sister hadn't left and married that soldier. But I hate war. And I'm against it under any circumstances.
Glad to hear it. We've got a little bit of time left. I'll go to the hands that are up again. It would be wonderful if the people who haven't raised their hands 3 or 4 times would feel they wanted to raise their hands. And those who want to raise their hands the 6th time, it's okay. But I want to, you know, I find that with current wars, the question is not actually, is this war justifiable? But how fast are you going to be recognizing that it isn't? Because when this country attacks Afghanistan, you can find some polls that find majority support for it. There could have been a public referendum and it would have still happened. And within a year, certainly a year and a half, every poll has a huge majority saying it never should have been started. Right? Which is not the same as saying it ended. I wish it were. But it never should have been started. Same with Iraq. Iraq is more debatable whether you ever had a majority, but certainly within a year and a half, you had a strong majority saying it never should have happened. And so when I wrote this book, War is a Lie, as a guide to prepare people to spot the lies, it wasn't to spot them eventually, or after Freedom of Information Act requests, or after good workshops at the Nonviolent Resource Center. It was to spot them immediately. Right? So let me throw a few at you. What if tomorrow we hear that some evil foreign dictator possesses or is about to use or has just used the wrong kind of weapons, chemical weapons, let's say, and therefore we need a war? What do you respond?
No, thank you.
Anybody who hasn't raised their hands, possible? Sorry, did you say something?
Well, So are we already doing what we're accusing the other people of?
We go at war with ourselves.
The answer to that is yes.
For sure, for sure.
Well, we're doing it on the microcosm as well. If our neighbor is dumping oil out onto his yard, we go over and try and control that situation. So we would try and control that, right? We would do what we could do to control that dictator. And whatever we do would seem justified.
Be careful who you believe.
Well, what most people who aren't as smart as anybody in this room say, and what the media conditions them to say by creating a whole debate on two sides of the question with everybody, taking a position, is that we need to find out whether it's true or not, whether those weapons of mass destruction were used or not, right?
Ask Connie
And
Rice.
what I want to say to speed things along a little bit is that there is no answer to that question that has any bearing whatsoever on the morality, legality, practicality of, or hypocrisy, as noted, of launching the greatest crime known to humanity. There is no crime that justifies a larger crime. And so the question was not, does Saddam Hussein have weapons of mass destruction? The question is not, does Assad have weapons of mass destruction, or has he used them? The question was, is there any clause in the UN Charter or the Kellogg-Briand Pact or anybody's thought-out sense of morality that allows bombing people's houses because of this reason? And there isn't, right? So we're pushed into discussing the wrong question that has no relevance.
Right.
Yeah.
Plus, nobody really in this country understands what it's like to grow up and be living in Afghanistan, or growing up and having a family in Iraq, or anything like that. So everything that makes people make those votes has nothing to do with reality. It has only to do with how the story has been cast and how people have been manipulated into going along with anything like that. So that drives me nuts. So what can we do about teaching people who humans are, and not being triggered to say yes to pulling the trigger?
We certainly need to teach people that humans aren't special if they have a certain appearance or religion or language or culture or nationality, and that's the one that's still acceptable to almost everybody in this country. That's the bigotry that remains most acceptable, is nationality. Beyond talking to people, we need people to, because for some bizarre reason, I can't explain it, it doesn't affect me, but human beings need to be quote-unquote humanized for people. They need to see stories of people and know the little details of their lives in a film, and then they become humanized. What the hell they were before, I can't tell you. They were something else, they weren't humanized. So we need people to know, Iranians and Russians and so forth.
Yes. And I think because they have a different religion, they don't know who learns about that religion. Who learns about all that, and then,
I'm helping organize a trip to Iran in January.
Oh, good.
So for anybody that might be interested, let me know afterward. But there are several points I wanted to just raise that haven't really been talked about, or you implied it, but I think the United States would be the most secure nation in the world if we quit the $1 trillion a year we're spending on wars and preparations for wars, and put that into what you're talking about, ending poverty, hunger, lack of education, health care, for every person in this country and every person in the world.
Clean energy.
We'd be the most loved nation in the world. Nobody would dare attack us.
That's right.
So that's one point. A second that we haven't talked about here is the Second World War was really a product of the First World War.
Right.
The way the United States and the rest of the world treated Germany after that war, really impoverishing, blaming, et cetera, laid the foundation for Hitler.
Right.
And if we had used the Marshall Plan, or did what the Quakers did, which was setting up soup kitchens for the children in Germany, and done that on a broad scale as a nation, there would have never been a Hitler. So wars sow the seeds for more wars. And after the Second World War, we sowed the seeds for the Cold War. And the Cold War has sowed the seeds for all the wars we've got now. So if what we want is security as a nation and a decent life for every person in this country and in the world, there's a lot better ways of doing it than spending $1 trillion a year for nuclear weapons, etc. And the final point, I don't know how many people have read Dan Ellsberg's new book, The Doomsday Machine, but he says if we have a full-scale nuclear war, billions of people are going to die immediately, and within a few years we're going to have nuclear winter, and essentially almost everybody in the world is going to die.
And a full-scale war is 1 or 2 thermonuclear weapons.
Well,
You said 3 would do away with all humanity.
But
One,
at any
maybe
rate, so
70%.
for any reason whatsoever, are we willing to risk human life for all future
Not
generations?
just human life.
Who do we think we are
Yeah.
that we're willing to risk the future of humanity because we don't like Assad in Syria or whoever else it is? It's totally insane.
So the only thing I would suggest is that maybe we can be careful how we use the word "we," because it's not the people in this room doing this, it's
Right.
sanity.
As a nation.
But the wrong questions they feed to us include the "why do they hate us" nonsense, right? Over 95% of suicide attacks explicitly motivated by trying to get the government out of the nation attacked, out of the nation of the person doing the suicide attack. 0%, exactly 0% of terrorist attacks are motivated by resentment for provision of food, water, medicine, green energy, right? It would take a tiny fraction of what is spent making the world hate the United States to make the world love the United States. And that would indeed be not just more secure on its own terms, but would free up hundreds of billions of dollars to spend on real dangers like environmental collapse. We had 1, 2, 3.
Just very quickly, I think you pointed out, what you said, David, is really true, but I think everybody in this room agrees with that. The question then becomes for me is how do you get the people to, back to your point with the economics, how do you get the people who really make the decisions within the deep state to go along with it?
That's the question.
That's the question.
The question for me is how do I have that conversation with anybody when I try to talk to my liberal, friends, and I'm not allowed to, I must vote for the lesser evil. They're charter members of the lesser evil baby steps society. And I'm told that I'm fomenting a divide within the blue religion or something. I mean, I'm not a registered Democrat. But how can I have that conversation with people when they insist that I'm supposed to support not him, or some other warmonger? I don't even know where to begin with that. I'm told that's not appropriate. We have to just go along with the program and accept what they give us.
Let me try. We may try to stop in 3 minutes. I don't know, even though we started late. But I'll try to answer both of these as best I can. But there was one more. Did you?
I did have my hand up. Yeah. What I've been struggling with in this conversation is something I know just a little bit about, which is why the people of El Salvador rose up against the power elite in El Salvador. And I've been thinking about the whole business of greed and the whole business of the sense of self that some people get by having power. And I think it kind of ties into what you were saying, but maybe at a slightly different level, which is, as much as I agree with what you're saying, with what many people are saying, I think of the people who go, well, but I want the power, I want the resources, I want that. And so my concern is, how do we, I must admit, I support what the people of El Salvador did, because they were being killed, because they were being starved to death, because they had no say in their own government or whatever. I mean, I'm not an expert on that. But to me, that is kind of where I keep running into the brick wall, which is the people with the power want the power.
So I'm not going anywhere, and I'll give everybody my email and phone number, encourage everybody to give everybody else the same, and I've also passed around a clipboard that I hope has gone partway around.
I want to say
by now,
that
but
the reason some of us didn't sign that is we signed it last night,
Understood.
so everybody signed it.
Understood, but just to try in, well, negative amount of time that's left, just very briefly, the choices, obviously, in relation to something like activity by Salvadorans are not limited to support or condemn. They can include, think there might have been an even better alternative. And just to throw out one thing that you can do of the many, many things that you can do, including organizing events like this one and working on divestment campaigns and working on lobbying efforts and working on nonviolent resistance movements, include going after political candidates in a way that isn't going to be condemned by their sycophants, which I would recommend. A couple days ago I wrote and put on my website, davidswanson.org, 20 questions that you must ask candidates for public office because no one else will ask them. And I was hoping we might get to that here today, but what is the number one foreign policy position that you will find on the websites of Democratic candidates, large D, Democratic candidates for United States Congress? Shout it out.
Support for Israel.
Security.
Yeah, security.
Military spending.
Military spending.
You are all wrong. It was a trick question. Almost none of them acknowledge the existence of the rest of the world in any way whatsoever. Almost, I know of one person in either big party running for Congress who has said one word about what the basic federal budget would look like, who's a brave woman who said she'd cut military spending by a quarter. Now, apart from many of them loving veterans, almost none of them have any statement whatsoever about what the basic budget should be. Is 60% for militarism a little bit too much, too little, just right? Nothing. No one will ask them if you don't. Almost none of them acknowledge the other 96% of humanity exists in any way. No position on international law, international courts, treaties that should be joined, treaties that should be abandoned. Nothing. Diplomacy, foreign aid, nuclear weapons, any other weapons, militarization of local police. Nothing. So I lay out basic, fundamental, non-threatening, objective, simple foreign policy questions that if we had respectable, decent, ethical foreign policy lobby institutions in this country, they would be getting candidates to fill out this survey and giving their answers.
I get thrown out.
Okay, well, it's past time. Who wants to stop and who doesn't? Raise your hand if you want to stop.
No.
Okay, one person wants to stop. We're going to excuse you and we'll keep going.
Thank you for coming.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. Yeah, so this is on davidswanson.org, questions you have to ask U.S. political candidates because nobody else will. Number one, what would you like the U.S. discretionary budget to look like? With 60% going to militarism, what percentage should that be? Number two, what program of economic conversion to peaceful enterprises would you support? Number three, would you end, continue, or escalate U.S. war making in, who can name the biggest 7 U.S. wars right now?
Afghanistan, Turkey.
Forget it. You know the Romans never had this problem. This is new. This is new to the world to have this problem.
Wait a minute, I didn't hear what your answer was.
Let me say it, you'll hear it.
Oh.
So change the list however you like, add, remove, but this was what I wrote down. Would you end, continue, or escalate U.S. war making in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Yemen, Pakistan, Libya, Somalia? Question mark. Number four, Would you end the exemption for militarism in the Kyoto, Paris, and other climate agreements? Number 5, this is a long one, tell me to shut up, but would you sign or ratify any of these treaties, the Paris Climate Agreement, the Convention on the Rights of the Child, the International Convention on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights, the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, optional protocols, the Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women, the Convention Against Torture's optional protocol, the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of their Families, the International Convention on the Protection of All Persons from Enforced Disappearance, the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities, the International Convention Against the Recruitment, Use, Financing, and Training of Mercenaries, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, the Convention on the Non-Applicability of Statutory Limitations to War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity, the Principles of International Cooperation in the Detention, Arrest, Extradition, and Punishment of Persons Guilty of War Crimes and Crimes Against Humanity, the Convention on Cluster Munitions, the Convention on Landmines, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, the proposed treaties banning the weaponization of space and banning cybercrimes. And you can add and remove, but the point is most of the world is party to basic human rights treaties that the United States isn't, and it might be relevant when someone is running for federal office to ask them what they think about that. It's not accusing them of being a capitalist pig. It's not declaring which evil is the greater evil. It's asking for
It is in Monterey.
basic information, right? So that was the longest one. That was the top 5, you know. But I have 20. But anyway.
Is the rights of the child on there?
Yes.
Because the U.S. is the only one
It
not
was on there,
signing
and I
that?
said it, and you are absolutely right. That's not the only one where the U.S. is the only one, also the Paris Climate and others. But why? Why would we have a convention on rights for children and have every nation on earth except this one? Not that they are all absolutely perfectly compliant, but sign and ratify and commit to complying
Nobody
with
tells
it.
us
Because there's not
Why?
as much profit in signing those as there is in not signing them. Because we have private prisons where children are being kept.
Because we're
And
bullies.
huge profit is being made.
Because the United States is special, and the rest of the world has a set of standards and rules and laws and behaviors, and the United States is above and doesn't have to behave like any of the other. What nation uses the veto and the silent veto, prevent before you get to a veto, in the UN Security Council as much as and more than all the others put together?
We don't believe in following a code of ethics anyway.
So anyway, that's one thing you can do, is take a set of questions and try to get basic answers, and then ask people what they think of those answers. You don't tell them what to do, ask them what they think.
David, couldn't you also ask them not to take money from weapons manufacturers like coke industry and
You certainly could.
We're getting pledges. We're getting pledges.
You certainly could, and you certainly should.
Wouldn't it be better to have this duplicated if we could? We could have copies.
It's online.
Trying to write down
It's
all of
online.
these questions.
It's online though. It's on your website.
On your website?
This and anything I ever write is at davidswanson.org. My speech from last night and the video from last night is at davidswanson.org. But I mean, I'm happy to give this to you, and you can figure out some way to make copies for other people. But the internet is
My pardon? Is there a Xerox here that makes copies of it?
Yeah.
Let's thank David for Swanson as well as David Hartsoe. And why don't we all stand and do one round of We Shall Abolish War as an institution. We'll be creative. We'll start with We Shall Overcome. We shall overcome. We shall overcome. We shall